Good evening and welcome. Thank you very much for coming. I think we have a treat in store for us tonight. I invited Neil Smith to the GSD in 1992 or 1993. It's almost 20 years ago when the second edition of his book, Uneven Development, had just come out. And it's really wonderful to have him back. I haven't seen him for almost 20 years until 10 minutes ago. We actually tried to get Neil here last year, and for a variety of reasons it wasn't possible, so it's great that he's here. I'm sure most of you are familiar with his work, but just wanted to remind everyone that Neil is at City University of New York at the Graduate Center, where he is basically in both anthropology and geography. Last year, I think, was it last year that we had David Harvey, who's a colleague of Neil's, and they work together pretty much in those areas at the same school. So they really have a kind of powerhouse operation. More recently, Neil has also been appointed at the University of Aberdeen. He's originally from Scotland, as the 6th century chair in geography and social theory. So that's quite a grand title, and he spends part of the time in Aberdeen, hopefully when the weather is a bit warmer than the winter months. Neil was trained as a geographer, and his research focuses on a number of areas, but really the intersection between space, nature, social theory, and history. He was until recently the director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at his school. And I think a lot of the work that he has done started with the research and investigations on gentrification, especially part of the work on Tompkins Square, and really the relationship between real estate, its impact on urban development. And I'm sure that the discussion or the presentation tonight also builds on some of these issues about the value of place. His interests in social theory include political economy and Marxism, and lie behind his theoretical work on uneven development, the book that I also mentioned before. From the global to the local scales, he argues our spatial worlds are constructed and reconstructed as expressions of social relations, and especially as expressions of capitalist social relations. Uneven development is, in many ways, the hallmark of capitalism. More recently, he has been studying the geography of the American century, trying to understand the ways in which global economic development in the 20th century, up to and including so-called globalization, represent specific expressions of US power and responses to it. This has also led to considerable research on the construction of geographical scale. He co-edits Society and Space and sits on the numerous editorial boards, including Social Text, Capitalism, Nature, and Socialism. After Uneven Development, he went on to publish The New Urban Frontier, Gentrification and the Revanchist City, published by Routledge, and then more recently, 2002, American Empire, Roosevelt's Geographer and the Prelude to Globalization. Would you please welcome Neil Smith.
Well, I'm delighted to be back here today and to get a chance to talk about some work which I think will suggest some continuities with the ideas that Motion suggested to you, but also strikes out in a slightly new direction as well, and in that sense it's slightly experimental. There are some ideas jumbling around in here. I'm not at all convinced I've got them all sorted out. Never mind get them sorted out in the right order. So I'm looking forward to a little bit of help as well as being able to present some of this material. I just recently came across, I'd always heard the story from years and years ago that T.S. Eliot as a poet had always said that if his butler couldn't understand what he was saying in his poetry, he should rip it up, throw it away, and start again. And I'd always taken a certain inspiration from that, especially since I didn't really understand what was going on in T.S. Eliot's poetry half the time. But I found, I think, an even better version of the same kind of sentiment, which actually comes from Margaret Mead. You can tell that being in this anthropology department is rubbing off on me somewhat. If one cannot state a matter clearly so that even an intelligent 12-year-old can understand it, Margaret Mead said once, one should probably remain within the cloistered halls of the university and the laboratory until one gets a better grasp of one's subject matter. So at my own peril, I'm inviting you to use that as a yardstick for what I'm going to try and sketch out today, and see if indeed they've let me loose from the cloistered halls of CUNY Graduate Centre in the middle of Manhattan for today. I've made it all the way to Harvard, somewhat cloistered too, of course. Whether I'm worthy to be let out in the streets or not, that'll be for you to judge. I'd like to thank Motion. I'd like to also thank Brooke King, who did a lot of the arrangement for this visit. The title that I gave was Urban Politics, Urban Security. And I have to say, in line with this being an experimental talk, I wasn't quite sure what I was grasping toward. So perhaps I'd like to add a subtitle just to help you to focus, which would be, to give it its Sunday name, Urban Politics, Urban Security, or Securing Accumulation, as the fuller title. So the focus is indeed going to be much more on urban security, because it seems to me that in the last at least a decade and more, much of the kind of research we've done in the broad fields of urban studies, urban research, have been veering toward the question of security in one form or another. In practice, of course, the signs of what I'd like to think of as a securitized urbanism are everywhere around us, from CCTV surveillance to body scanners to get into buildings, to bag checks, to biometrics and eye pattern recognition technologies. To go to my dentist in Manhattan, I actually have to have my eyes biometrically tested to make sure I am who they think I am. I would have thought going to the dentist would already have confirmed that you were who you were, but apparently this added layer of eye, in addition to dental security, is required for me to get a root canal. All of the other forms of securitization with which you're familiar apply here. Gated urbanism, of course, for those of us interested in landscapes, questions of security on the internet, and so on, especially if you've been watching the news the last couple of days. The attacks on the Iranian internet system that seem fairly clearly to have come from the US or Israel or Britain or some amalgam thereof. So the question of security has really become a central issue, I think, for those of us looking at cities. A recent article in a book by Michael Sorkin, Indefensible Space, an edited collection, this article by Jeremy Nymeth called The Closed City, actually documented that within the financial and downtown districts of LA, New York, and San Francisco, there was an average of about 18% of the supposedly public open space was in fact under some form of evident securitization. What was even more interesting about his figures was the unevenness between them. That San Francisco was a mere 4.5% of that downtown financial area. New York City came in at just over 18%, and LA came in just under 50% at 48% of downtown and the financial district of LA that was securitized in what we would normally have thought of as previously public space. Now, also in the urban literature, there's a broadening of this documentation of insecuritization, if you like. And I think here in particular of work that's being done on children, parental hypervigilance, the nanny cams that are stuck into teddy bears so that parents can monitor the nannies looking after their kids, those kinds of things. There's a whole series of articles by a variety of folks in a book called Fear, Critical Geographies and Urban Day Life by Rachel Palin and Susan Smith. Cindy Katz in particular, and a number of other feminists have been the ones who have been pursuing that kind of work. Outside North America and Europe, of course, it's a similar picture, and it's not so novel a picture as well. That the securitization of cities from Dubai to Sao Paulo, from Baghdad to Kabul, is old news for many of us. And in particular, especially if we think about Baghdad and Kabul, what we're looking at is a securitization that's connected to a certain nexus of war and development. So all of that comes into the picture. Having said that, and given you that kind of broad terrain, it seems to me that there are three events, really, that I want to focus on as probably major events in US urbanism, at least, over the last decade or more. And I say this, and I'll come back to this in a minute, I say this on top of having actually been at the Toronto G20 police clampdown in June of this year, where, although I think many of those events were not well reported in the press in the United States, it was actually a very noteworthy event. There was something like 1,150 to 1,200 people arrested. Fully 3/4 of those simply released after the event without charges, a tactic that had been used, of course, during the 2004, as we say in New York, the Republican National Convulsion of 2004. But this is particularly noteworthy insofar as it was happening in Canada, which, at least for those of us with a bit of a distance, perhaps, from the Canadian border, think of Canada as a somewhat meek country, the kinder, gentler neighbour to the north, until, that is, Stephen Harper became Prime Minister, I suppose. And we think especially of Toronto in terms of the old, somewhat British, royalist framing of Toronto as Toronto the Good. So here you had a rampage and a siege by police in downtown Toronto in June of this year, another of the signs of dramatic securitization. I've written a paper on this with Deborah Cowan, who's at the Department of Geography in Toronto, and that paper's coming out in Human Geography soon. I'm not going to go into that much during this presentation, but if you want to talk about events in Toronto, I can do that. The three events in the US that I really want to touch on should be quite obvious. The first, of course, is 9/11. And we always think of 9/11 as the moment when New York City, or in the language of the New York Times on September 12th of that year, America was attacked. New York City was attacked. It was an attack on the city. What's actually fallen out, and what's very interesting, of course, is that so was Washington, D.C. There were more than 100 lives lost as a result of the plane that hit the Pentagon. And of course, that's a much more embarrassing lack of security in a city in the United States, insofar, of course, as it was the headquarters of US global militarism that was attacked and effectively taken out during that event. So there's been a fallout from that event in really two cities and a field in Pennsylvania. Fallout from that event that has been global in geographical terms, but global too, perhaps in more metaphorical terms, spanning everything from physical reconstruction of cities to senses of social insecurity and even psychic or existential insecurity. The second event, of course, is Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And what this highlighted, I think, was a social or socio-ecological insecurity of cities in the United States. An extraordinary amalgam, I'll go into this a bit later, an extraordinary amalgam of social and ecological vulnerability of the city of New Orleans that was highlighted in that event. And the third event, of course, too, is the subprime crisis and the way in which the subprime mortgage crisis not only became a means of extraordinary urban insecurity in social and economic terms in the first place in the United States, but of course throughout the housing market, and eventually it was the event that triggered, if it didn't exactly cause, it triggered a global financial recession, which many economists have come to call the Great Recession. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to read through the Great Recession to sense the desperation involved in that nomenclature. The Great Recession was meant to explain that this was a recession bigger than other recessions. This was pretty bad, but it wasn't quite yet the Great Depression. So there was a sense of limits and of moderation to how bad that recession was. Whether it's over or not, the Bureau of Economic Statistics, Bureau of Economic Analysis notwithstanding, is not clear. Whether there's a second downturn remains very much to be seen. So with that kind of landscape laid out, if I can put it that way, what's new here? I think the underlying intent of much of the literature that's talking about urban security, urban securitization, and the insecurity of urban areas is very much to suggest that something new is afoot. And I think what I want to try and do is as much a diagnosis of what might be new and what might not be new as it is an analysis. There are really four kinds of responses, I think, that we've had to this, at least let's say for now, intensified securitization of the city and intensified attention to questions of securitized urbanism. And the first, and I think this will be easily recognizable, the first response really to the question of urban security and securitization has been to say that we're living through an exceptional moment, most broadly. And this argument, that this is an exceptional moment, this argument gets considerable intellectual buttressing from the work, of course, of Agamben, whose work on state of exception, the state of exception, has been very popular to the point of fashionable in the last few years. Perhaps in the last year or so, not so much so. Too many so's in that sentence. Agamben's argument, of course, was that under particular circumstances, we could see the state operating in quite exceptional ways. The second response, I think, was different, and it was really a lament about the extent to which this securitization of the city and this and sense of insecuritization and the need to act to defray the effects of insecuritization have led to a certain privatization of public space, a loss of public space. Indeed, the subtitle of the article by Nymeth called The Closed City that I referred to earlier is Downtown Security Zones and the Loss of Public Space. So that sense of the loss of public space, I think, is also very current right now as a response. The third response, I think, though, is really that of the militarization of the city. There's an emerging literature about exactly the militarization of the city, and I'm thinking especially of the work by Steve Graham, who's a Durham geographer, who's come out with a book just recently called Cities Under Siege, The New Military Urbanism. But he had an edited collection earlier called, I think it was Cities, Wars and Terror, or Cities, Wars and Terrorism, which some of you may know. But Cities Under Siege, The New Military Urbanism. And that has really gathered quite a lot of traction, I think, in the literature, and there's some very interesting material in there. The fourth response, which we're seeing, and this is coming from a rather different position, I think, is a lot of the work and a lot of the discussion that's being held around questions of the right to the city. And again, as I'm going to obviously stress, the arguments about the right to the city aren't just from this latter 10-year period. They, of course, have a longer history to them. But nonetheless, they represent, if you like, a critique in some ways of the securitization of the city, but the kinds of social, economic, political, and more psychic entailments that come with that securitization. So what indeed is new here? How do these four responses, in one way or another, suggest to us that there really is something new, that we're in a new moment when it comes to the nexus between security and the city? And I'm going to argue in the first place, I'm going to go on and contradict myself, of course, but I'm going to argue in the first place that no, there's not much that you can pick out from these explanations that suggests some really dramatically new moment historically. First, let's take Agamben's argument about the state of exception, and especially perhaps, to be somewhat fair to Agamben, the way in which his argument has been taken up as much as the argument itself. And here I think we only need to think back to the work of Max Weber comes most immediately to mind, who, of course, in the Economy and Society book, Max Weber says, and this is very rarely quoted, but in fact, I went back and found the quote, "The claim to the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order is exactly what defines the state. The definition of the state itself is the claim to be able to use legitimate force, legitimate violence in defense of the social order." So the claim to exceptionalism is already written into what the state is. Now, here's a case where Weber isn't arguing anything especially different from what Vladimir Lenin, for example, might have argued about the capitalist state. The parallel there is fairly exact if you go back and look at Lenin on the State and Revolution, for example, which would probably be the best place to go. But it's also thoroughly consonant with Walter Benjamin's arguments as well on violence, where Benjamin, this is in a chapter on critique of violence in Reflections, where Benjamin says, and this is the quote, "The law's interest in a monopoly of violence vis-à-vis individuals is not explained by the intention of preserving legal ends, but rather by that of preserving the law itself. That violence, when not in the hands of the law, threatens it, not by the ends that it may pursue, but by its mere existence outside the law." Now, in case the 12-year-olds who are supposed to be monitoring this are indeed in the audience, I'd like to actually just translate that Benjamin quote, which gets a little convoluted, into, there's a moment where Richard Burton as Julius Caesar, or no, I think as Mark Antony in the movie on Julius Caesar, says something like, as he's setting off on an expedition, he says, "Look after the legions, because the legions are what make the law legal." And it seems to me that's exactly what Weber and Lenin and Benjamin in very different kinds of ways are saying. I've actually looked for that quote. I would love to find that it actually did come from Julius Caesar himself. You know, take care of the legions because they're what make the law legal. I would love to find that quote in Julius Caesar, but so far I haven't managed to do so. It's in the film, and so yes, you recognize the dilemma. Thank you. The second question, if we're going to think not what's so new and what's not so new, is really that of the loss of public space. And here I think we can dispatch with this argument much more quickly. In the first place, I think the separation of private and public space is somewhat of a misnomer in itself. If we look at the kinds of public spaces that many of us like to think of as public, what actually makes them public? And where's the boundary between private and public space? If we think about a mall, actually if you think about any commercial location, virtually, it's a private space. It's almost certainly privately owned. There could be publicly owned spaces, but almost all privately owned in one form or another. In the case of a mall, there's certainly security police around and so forth. But the very fact of that being a private space, the success of it as a private space is dependent entirely on it being at the same time a public space. A mall that's private space that locks people out is not going to get very far, right? And the same is true all over the examples of public space that we have. That in practice, the distinction between private and public space is a very, very difficult one to make. And the fact that it's become fuzzier and that the fuzziness of the boundary between private and public space is now erring toward the priority of the private over the public really shouldn't surprise us too much. In fact, at one level, I think a lot of the lament about the loss of the public space really represents, in many ways, a kind of wishful Jacobsian liberalism, Jane Jacobs, that would be, with a sort of 18th century ideal for public space that's available for the masses. And I think if we were to push that idea of public space too far, we would be able to poke significant holes in it. I'm going to leave that for now for your imaginations, but if you want to, we can come back to it. The third argument, and I think this is a much more serious argument, is that of the militarization of the city, the Steve Graham argument. And I think that what Graham is doing here is capturing something very real. The kinds of wars that we think of, the world wars of the 20th century, for example, the wars of the 19th century, certainly through a Euro-centred perspective, those kinds of wars tended to take place in much wider open spaces. The wars of conquest, whether we're talking about Rome or whether we're talking about European colonialism, were often wars of wide open spaces, more than wars of cities. Not that cities weren't involved, of course they were. Today, those are not the kinds of wars that jump up to us immediately in our imaginations concerning what's going on. The wars are in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. The wars in the Balkans in the 1990s were very much city-based and city-oriented. And so I think that there is something being captured in this notion of the militarization of the city, with the nexus of war and urbanism. And yet, of course, if we go back and scratch the historical surface, that too is not really new. We know about the sacking of cities in the past as part of warfare, whether it was Baghdad itself in times past, or whether it was cities such as Paris or other cities within the European orbit that we might not see as clearly as we would see the battlefields of the Second World War or the First World War. And so I think that it's very difficult to make the argument about the novelty of the militarization of the city, especially too if we broaden out this notion of the militarization of the city. Cities have always been military strongholds. The very form of the city, the walled city, the fortress city, the city as stockade, these were always militarized places. These were places of power that were militarily protected. And so it shouldn't really surprise us today to find that, perhaps in a cyclical kind of way, that emphasis on the militarization of the city has again come back. The more interesting question, it seems to me, is not just the observation of the militarization of the city, but to what extent is it a reasonable generalization? Aren't we forgetting about the wars in Central Africa, for example, in making this argument? And why would there be a cyclical shift back to a militarization of the city now compared to in other periods? The fourth argument that I raised here is really that of the right to the city. And I'm not going to say too much about it here because I want to really finish off with the right to the city. But it seems to me that there's a very different tenor to the argument about the right to the city that's going on here, but very much evoked, at least in the last decade or more, as in some ways a direct or indirect response to the question of urban securitization. So, at best, I would say we can't find the concrete evidence in those kinds of responses to suggest that there's a new kind of regime of securitized urbanism operating. Let me switch gears and move kind of sideways and in a sense go back to the empirics of the three events now that I raised at the beginning in US urbanism. Katrina, the subprime crisis, and 9/11. And begin to look at them. Because I think if we begin to interrogate these three events, we begin to see something of a commonality across the three events. At least I'm going to do a bit of a job to try and pull out a commonality between the three events that might push us in the direction of seeing some kind of novelty to urban securitization. So let's first take Katrina. Now, I probably don't have to really repeat the argument here that, of course, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Even earthquakes, as disasters, are not natural. The causes the events themselves are natural, no question. Actually, there's geological evidence that earthquakes can be fomented by the pumping of liquids into various faults on the face of the earth. So it's possible to lubricate, quite literally, earthquakes. But that's not really what we're talking about here. And that's a relatively extreme event. The events themselves may be rooted in nature, but as a disaster, they are not natural events. What's most interesting about Katrina is actually, I would argue, the socio-political ecology of the event. And here I'm going to point toward a series of shifts that took place both locally, nationally and globally that help us to frame and understand how Katrina could have taken place. I'm going to do this very sketchily, and some of this will be familiar to you, perhaps some of it less so. In doing so, I'm going to resort as some sort of a shorthand to the notion of the neoliberal moment in capitalist development. And I do so with some sense of caution, because I think the language of neoliberalism is widely overused and underdefined right now. I think there is a specificity to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism literally is a harkening back to 18th and 19th century models of liberalism in an economic sense, which emphasize private property, competition, the state's role as perpetrator of that competition, and the belief that the social good would result from all of these things, from the competition and the private property and the social relations on what they were built. However, we have to be aware that today the language of neoliberalism has been somewhat degraded and generalized as much an epithet as an analysis. It wasn't me what done it, Gov. It was neoliberalism. You know, that kind of appeal. Of course, we have to see too on the other side that there's a certain post-structuralist argument of the same sort. It wasn't me, Gov. It was the discourse what done it. Right. So, relatively new ideas that have a sharp critical edge to them often become mulched into quite blunt ideas. And so in talking about neoliberalism here and not doing much more to define it and resharpen it, I'm hoping that you'll at least bear with me and give me the benefit of the doubt, Govs. The Katrina event, the first of the three. Now there was a 6,000-page report. I have not read all of it. The Corps of Engineers produced in May 2006, I think it was, that documented a lot of the conditions that went up to the Katrina event and why it was that this isn't exactly their figure, but perhaps 1,500 people died in a meteorological event that really should not have killed anyone. And there's a number of issues that become quickly apparent. On the one hand, the neoliberalization of the local economy at the hands of the national state. There was a devolution of power to the local economy. Actually had a second result, which was a fragmentation of jurisdictions around New Orleans, which meant that you had congressional districts competing with each other, you had separate levy boards competing with each other for funds, and certain city officials, each representing different neighborhoods, also competing in ways that hadn't necessarily happened before. Now this was straight text and verse of the neoliberalism revolution, if you like, of the 80s and 90s. That level of competition would replace the kind of public provisions that the state, at different scales, had been accustomed to provide under a more Keynesian kind of a model. That led to a number of things. On the one hand, budgets at the centre were cut. The Corps of Engineers budget was cut by 80% in the period leading up to Katrina. But it also meant that there was a patchwork, a very uneven fragmentation in the provision of funds for building and sustaining levees and for other water and ecological management activities, which became crucial when the hurricane hit. FEMA, the Emergency Management Administration, was effectively shunted to the side of a much larger Homeland Security Department. Again, you notice the connection between home, the domestic, homeland, and security that's coming in here. Hence, I think the broader sense of urban securitization and insecuritization that's afoot. Not only was it shuffled to the side of the Department of Homeland Security, but it was given to a man, Michael Brown, whose previous acumen and experience had been in buying and selling Arabian racehorses. Not exactly the kinds of qualifications one might want for someone to do the emergency management and post facto cleanup in a place like New Orleans. The design of the canals. The canals themselves were designed for commercial purposes, for purposes of getting goods into and out of the port so that the port could compete with Houston, for example, and with other ports globally. With not a lot of thinking about what this was going to do to the local ecology, to the wetlands, to the water ecology of the area, and of course the connection onto the city. And in the end, what happened was that the canals became a major source rather, of funneling the water into the city as a result of the hurricane, with levels in the canals 2 feet above the already heightened storm surge levels in the broader outlying delta areas, and with the water moving inland at something like 10 times the velocity that it was moving outside the canals. And so the canals became these funnels for water into the city rather than out. When you piece that then together with the processes of gentrification, of suburbanization, of the wetland decimation that was taking place, all of this in the 1990s, 2000s, under an extraordinary expansion of property capitalism, if I can put it that way, that was affecting obviously not just New Orleans, but much of the rest of the country. You see the ingredients for the disaster that finally happened. There's a lot more that can be said about that. But just to give you a sense of comparison, at the time, this hasn't really remained prominent in the news, but at the time there were some news stories that compared the response to Katrina with the responses, for example, in Cuba to hurricanes, where without taking a position one way or another on the Cuban government or anything like that, nonetheless there are in place these highly centralized forms of moving people out of the way of hurricanes that come in. Highly developed, centralized plans that simply take over the bus systems of Cuba to get people out of the way of hurricanes coming in. The alternative in New Orleans, of course, was we assume you've got a car, get out on your own. And that literally is written into the pre-Katrina FEMA plans. You're on your own, make good plans now. So the neoliberal framework of the prior 20-odd years had everything to do with that particular urban disaster. It created an insecurity in New Orleans, and that's without even getting to the point of talking about the extraordinary levels of poverty, the extraordinary levels of class and race oppression that were going on in what, in most of the indicators at this period, showed New Orleans in a city that came up in most of the indicators as the poorest city, the most segregated city, one of the most crime-ridden cities in the country. The second example that I wanted to take was the subprime crisis. And here the connection, I think, is going to be much more obvious to, if you like, the excesses of neoliberalism. How did the subprime crisis come about? Well, I think everybody's got a fairly good, if sometimes sketchy, sense of what was going on here. On the one hand, we can talk about deregulation of the property industry, the mortgage industry, the financialization of mortgages in the form of securities and so forth. And these are the kind of technical details of what was happening inside the mortgage market. But it's a broader question than that. And we see that Marxists and political economists of various sorts have always argued Lefebvre was probably the sharpest to do so in the early days. David Harvey's picked up the work, and others have too, to argue that as the profit rates in industrial production decline, Marx, of course, talked about a decline in the profit rate, capital moves out of the industrial sector, and it moves into other sectors that are more profitable. It moves, for example, into the financial sector, which of course was exactly why mortgages were so sought after, and with the deregulation of the property markets were so available to be packaged and sold in the markets. There's a financialization of the search for profits. But capital also moves into the construction industry, it moves into real estate, it moves into the production of place, the production of space. And again, you can see the connection to Lefebvre's work here. And that was going on too at the same time. And in fact, we can make a connection to Lefebvre's larger argument, which comes in his book on the urban revolution, where he says that at some point industrialization is going to be superseded by urbanization. Now, when I first read this, I thought, you know, as a good young Marxist, just having read his Marx 2 or 3 times to make sure he got it as right as he was about to get it, I thought, well, how can that be? The problem, of course, was that most of us as researchers and theorists were thinking about the construction market, the real estate industry, as somehow a service industry vis-a-vis industrial production. And we even, I don't think the left did this, but in our work, we even used categories like FIRE, F-I-R-E, finance, insurance, real estate, which of course lumps together finance and insurance with real estate. Right? Now, there's a problem here, because finance and insurance certainly are about the circulation of capital. There's no profit made, by and large, in the finance and insurance industries, whereas real estate is very much about construction. There's a massive amount of surplus value made in direct Marxist terms, but a massive amount of profit on the production of commodities made in the real estate industry. So our categories themselves were hiding us from the power and importance of the move of capital into the construction industry. And that was happening in the period in the 1990s, 2000s. It turns out, and if anything, the subprime crisis really is proof of Lefebvre's arguments about, if not the supplanting. Lefebvre was great at making an argument. He starts the urban revolution by saying the world is 100% urbanized. And you go, that's not true. And of course it's not true. And Lefebvre knew it wasn't true. And he goes on to explain why it's not true, but then comes back to tell you why it's true anyway. And with Lefebvre also notoriously did not edit anything he wrote, so there's sentences that just trail off into the middle of nowhere. So when you're reading Lefebvre, it took me a few reads of some of these books, but when you're reading Lefebvre, if you think it doesn't make sense, you're probably right. And I don't say that as a critique of Lefebvre. I mean, the brilliance of Lefebvre's insights were there. He just didn't always know how to follow them up and see them through to the end. But it seems to me that one of the sharpest insights was precisely this argument that the construction industry performs as what he called a kind of parallel sector that attracts capital when industrial profit rates begin to slump. And indeed, what happened in Ireland, by 2006, 23% of the gross domestic product in Ireland was the construction industry. 23%, virtually a quarter of the economy was construction. And that's extraordinary. It's totally in tune with what Lefebvre was arguing. By comparison, I only have figures for Europe. Portugal and Spain came out at 17 to 18% each. They were the next highest, if you like. The average of all of the European countries included within the EU at the time, 2006, was about 12% of the GDP was construction. I've looked in vain for figures for the United States, and I'm not going to hazard a guess at where they would look. But what is important is that, of course, those figures, those percentage figures, increased dramatically in the period leading up to the subprime crisis of 2007. Now, there's some really interesting work that was done early before the crisis itself by Elvin Wiley and Cathy Newman. Cathy Newman at Rutgers, Elvin Wiley at UBC in Vancouver, where they were actually tracking the mortgage market and doing it not from within the mortgage industry itself, but as somewhat critical academics. And you can see that by 2006, they don't quite predict the crash, but they effectively do. And they explain how the bureaucratic and political processes operating melded with the economic shifts to give you a very good sense of the political economy of the crash to come without knowing that that's really what they were doing. So I'd recommend, if people wanted, to go back and read that work. The third case that I want to look at here is really that of 9/11, and so much has been said about this, and the entailments of 9/11 for security and securitization are probably very obvious. There are 1,000,001 adventures that we could take out of the events of 9/11 that would make the connection to securitized urbanism. One that I'm finding particularly interesting, actually, is the connection between war and law. And I think the work of David Kennedy, who's, I guess he's in the Kennedy School, David Kennedy, yeah. Law School, that's right, Law School, thanks, Motion. His book on Of Law and Of War and Law, or Of Law and War, I keep getting the order mixed up, is very interesting in beginning to, this is really a sort of second generation critical legal studies work that's being done. And it's very interesting in making the connections between law and war. Not in the old way where we thought that wars were supposed to be organized so that they stayed within the law, and there were separate kinds of laws that pertained to war, and the law represented a certain kind of limit on war. What Kennedy's argued is the flip of that, which is that there's something called lawfare. The law leads, in effect. The legal statutes, the legal structures are established, the legal precedents organized ahead of the movement that becomes war. In the old model, there was a dependence on a kind of sense that war was exceptional and peace was the opposite of war. In the new model, that distinction between peace and war breaks down dramatically. And it seems to me that that's very, very redolent of what's been happening, at least since 2001. But I'm going to argue also that it was happening beforehand as well. To cut a long story short, it's very easy, and I think widely accepted, that 9/11 becomes the crux, or the moment when the new regime of urban security and urban insecurity is instantiated, becomes real. It was 9/11, what did it gov? Now, I think that that's a real misreading of the history. In the same way that I've tried to suggest that there was a neoliberal flavor to the creation of Katrina, a neoliberal DNA to what became the subprime crisis. There was also the events of 9/11 and the response to the events were themselves rooted in a very particular moment in history that we need to track back 2 or 3 decades before 2001. In particular, by their own statements, Al-Qaeda was very clear that 9/11 was payback for the US becoming involved in, among other things, the Iraq War of 1991. But also in the larger involvement in the Middle East by US capital and by the US military. Now, what's going on here, of course, is a much larger project. This isn't just a war for oil. It wasn't that in 1991, much as Kuwait was used as an excuse then. And it wasn't a war for oil either, as much of the left tended to make the argument after 2001. Oil was involved. There's no way it was not involved. Eduardo Galeano has this great sentence in, I've forgotten the name of the book now, Nights of Love and War. Somebody will know the title. I can't remember the title of the book. He has this great thing. He said, where oil is involved, there are no innocent deaths. Right? And that certainly pertains here. But this was about a lot more than a war on oil, or a war for oil and for resources. It wasn't a geopolitical war in the end. The tactics may have been geopolitical. The strategy was geo-economic. This was a war about global economic control. It was a geo-economic war. It was a war that was intended to be the last nails in the coffin of US power, US global power, US global economic power backed up by the military over a global economy. It was, as I put it in my book on Endgame, this was the end game of globalization. It was going to take a political military strategy to finish off the work that, of course, was being done through economic means in the projects of neoliberal globalization. So I seem to have done a pretty good job, at least for myself, of convincing myself that there's not a lot that's new in this new regime of urban securitization. So what rabbit am I going to pull out of the hat to convince you that actually there is something a little new that's going on after all? And I really wasn't very sure how I was going to do this, and I've actually been sitting trying to, I knew there was something in there that was bothering me, and I've really been trying to work it out, and I'm not convinced I've got it completely worked out. But here's how it kind of fell out for me. I was looking back at some older work from the 1990s and thinking about the work on revanchism, and especially my own local, very localized work on New York. When you say to people, when you go give a talk in Europe or something, you work in New York, they think you work on global questions or something. No, Lower East Side, it's highly local, you know. So my own local work in New York, and it was there that you could sense in the 1990s, beginning with campaigns against homeless people in the early 1990s, much of it under Giuliani, the emergence of what I at the time came to call the revanchist city. This really was a matter of right-wing revenge and reaction against the people who were deemed to have stolen the city from us. The us being the largely white, but certainly middle class, often suburban people who had every right to own the city in some larger sense than just private capitalist property. They had stolen the city from us. It all began in the dreadful 1960s, and it was time to take it back. And you could see this writ large in the way in which Giuliani in particular approached the question of zero tolerance policing in the city. And there was a case of, I wouldn't have called it that at the time, but securitization of the city that was going on. Now, those strategies of zero tolerance, of course, very quickly became internationalized. So there are continents all across the world, except for Antarctica, so far as I know, but I'm ready to be surprised. Cities picked up, maybe that's the problem with Antarctica, is the lack of cities. Cities picked up the strategies of zero tolerance, sometimes with comedic effect. Giuliani actually went to Mexico City at one point and was given a $4 million contract after he had left the mayoralty, and was asked what they should do to make the city safer, especially with an eye, Carlos Slim, the multimillionaire in Mexico City, especially with an eye to attracting the tourist industry, which of course is another part of this whole equation, not least in New Orleans. But in Mexico City, what they should do to attract the tourist industry. And Giuliani thought about it for a bit, and then a few days later it turned up in the front pages of the New York Times, in the A section, a picture of Giuliani's idea for tourist police, which were these Mexican police on horseback with huge sombreros hanging out in the middle of Mexico City. For $4 million, they got the stereotype of themselves from Hollywood sent back to them in practice. Now, there were more serious efforts to instantiate zero tolerance policing everywhere from Sao Paulo to Sydney to Glasgow to all across the world. And I began to think then of the kind of revanchist planet. That seemed a little too easy. But nonetheless, being a whore for writing, I couldn't stop myself from using that phrase, revanchist planet, and so I did. And as I was thinking about this in the last few weeks, I began to think, well, actually, there's a connection here. And I was thinking back to Peck and Tickell's work on neoliberalism more generally, And the distinction they make, which I think is actually a very useful distinction, again with limits, but the distinction between the roll-back neoliberalism and the roll-out neoliberalism. That in the first phase of neoliberalism from the mid-1970s, there's a rolling back of the old Keynesian state, a rolling back of the institutions that stood in the way of neoliberal market power and market authority, and the assumption that the market was the appropriate social arbiter of pretty much every question that came up. That was the roll-back phase. The roll-out phase was kind of the new plan. It was how neoliberalism was to be put into action as if on a clean slate. And there's a connection, of course, there with something like Thomas Friedman's It's a Flat Earth. You know, you've got a tabula rasa that you can just, you can resculpt it however you want to do it. And it began to occur to me that something like a shift from revanchism as a rollback, a struggle against an urbanism that had emerged in the post-Second World War period under the rubric of liberal urban policy. There was a rollback against that liberal urban policy, which really was coming to bits in the 1970s. It was fragmenting, coming apart. And what was beginning to happen with the economics of urban expansion, with the political ecology questions, not just around Katrina in New Orleans, but around transportation and a whole series of other issues to do with urban growth, around literally the universalization of gentrification from a relatively small neighborhood by neighborhood, house by house process to a global urban strategy geared at global tourism. That shift represented something like a shift from a rollback securitization of the city to a roll-on securitization of the city, a roll-out securitization of the city. And I think there's a lot of, I think there's something in that. I think that way of seeing the historical specificity. What it allows us to do, I think, is to understand on the one hand that urban securitization and the emergence of deep-seated psychic existential insecurities are on the one hand connected to the economic and political insecurities that are perhaps easier to diagnose. But it also allows us to see that it's not some long-term absolute cutoff in the history of cities. It does represent a new phase to a kind of roll-out urban securitization. And that, I think, puts the issue somewhat in historical, but also scalar perspective, and then also provides a certain kind of political perspective. How are we to grapple with this? As long as we just say, you know, neoliberalism done it, it becomes an impossible target. It's a hollow target. It's too big and too amorphous, and you can't touch it. Once you begin to see the limits to the new securitization, the ways in which it's not new, but then the senses in which it is new, the ways in which this rollout securitization is in fact in play, I think it becomes a much more handleable issue in terms of the second part of the title, the urban politics. Now, I'm not going to go on for the same amount of time on urban politics. I'm actually just going to finish on the question of the right to the city. But having said that, let me just say one other slightly more optimistic thing, which is, although an argument about, or a series of arguments about neoliberalism in its different forms in different places at different times, a series of arguments about neoliberalism do undergird what I'm trying to argue here. I would also like to argue, contradicting myself again, that neoliberalism, to borrow Jürgen Habermas's totally felicitous and slightly mischievous phrase, which he applied in the 80s about modernism, neoliberalism is actually dead but dominant now. And I'm always challenged as being a bit too optimistic when I say that. It's dead in the sense that there are no new ideas coming out from neoliberalism now. There's no question that between the 70s and into the 21st, well, the end of the 1990s, let's say, the intellectual momentum was with the right politically. And it was all connected to one version or another of this rollout of neoliberalism. They had the momentum, there's no question. A series of things took that momentum apart. And this isn't the place to analyze those issues, but I do think that it has to do with the financial crisis in Asia in the late 1980s. The anti-globalization movement deserves an awful lot more credit than it was given from the 1990s, much as it's now fragmented into various other kinds of threads, but it showed for the first time from the other side that there was nothing inevitable. Margaret Thatcher was wrong. There is an alternative. The anti-globalization movement put that on the table. Latin American struggles in particular that took on neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as a name in English really has two sources that were parallel. One was, in fact, the neoliberals themselves, von Hayek, Friedman, and so on, who called themselves neoliberals back in the 30s and 40s. But the other was in the 70s, very much on the heels of the Chile coup against Allende, where it was Latin American activists who recognized the connection back to orthodox liberalism, if you like, and coined the term neoliberalism. And it took us 20 years or more in the United States and Europe to pick up and catch up with that language. Neoliberalism, of course, is one of those things that's meant to make us Americans totally confused, because if it's liberal, it's supposed to be left-wing, but then it's neoliberal and it's totally right-wing. How could that be? But that's a whole different topic. So neoliberalism is dead in the sense that it's no longer an engine of change intellectually or politically. It's dominant in that there are no alternatives to it. It's dominant in that what's happening now is not a running away from neoliberalism, even as a number of economists themselves have done just that, have run away from the assumptions of neoliberalism. Sachs, Stiglitz, among others. But it remains dominant because there's no other game yet in town. And that puts the emphasis then on an oppositional urban politics. And that's where I think that the question of the right to the city comes in. And so literally, just to conclude on that note, it seems to me, if we take the analysis seriously about what is and is not new about securitized urbanism today, then we have to think about the right to the city in somewhat more specific terms than Lefebvre gave us. Classically, this was one of the things that Lefebvre throws off in the middle of a book, which he then decides later to call the right to the city, without ever really telling us what the right to the city is. It remains an incredibly vague idea, but yet politically grabbing and powerful for so many people. Let's take Lefebvre's own lesson. There's a sort of a right to the city in physical terms. There's a right to physical access in the city. There's a right to the city in social terms. There's a right to social ownership, by which I don't mean private property, but ownership in a broader sense of the city. And third, there's a right to the city in mental terms, in psychic terms, and in existential terms. A right to the feeling of security in the city. To live in a city where you don't turn a corner every time and find that the terrorist code alert level has been raised from orange to red, or getting up in the morning and while you know it's crazy, hoping that it's actually been brought down from red to orange again the next day, where that level of deliberate construction of fear is no longer the psychic element of the city. Now, of course, that three-part division mirrors Lefebvre's own argument about the need to put together physical space, social space, and mental space, all of which involves a critique of French social theory in the 1970s, through which he was living as he was 60s and 70s as he's writing this material. So I think that's a fertile place to go, to begin to take apart and reconstruct the notion of the right to the city. The problem with the right to the city argument is that it can indeed mean all things to all people. It's highly susceptible to being rendered into a rather flat, I think, liberal argument about justice and equality in a way that separates more than it needs to those kinds of issues, justice and equality, from the kinds of social relations that give rise to injustice and inequality. And it's that, it seems to me, that connection that needs to be preserved. How is that to be done? Well, we have an opportunity with the right to the city precisely because I don't think in the end it's a totally intellectual question. It's a practical issue. And the fantastic thing about Lefebvre's right to the city argument, raised in 1968 as it was, in the context of a whole different question of urban security and urban uprising, 1968 in Paris. The point precisely here is that the idea has been picked up by groups which are homeless support groups, anti-gentrification groups, by unions, by other political movements, small, not so small, that are fighting to instantiate, to make real, to make happen something called the right to the city in practice. And it seems to me that to the extent that we intellectualize the right to the city, and this is not an anti-intellectual argument, but to the extent that we over-intellectualize the right to the city argument, we'll intellectualize it out of existence. We're all trained as deconstructionists these days. We're all post-structuralists. We can take apart anything. We can take apart a piece of granite discursively if we want to. That's not the trick. The trick is to put it back together again, see how it works. And that's where we begin to look to things like the Right to the City Alliance that's been formed. Small, modest, lots of successes, some failures, but we begin to look to what they're doing and forge the connections. Unlike in the past, when it was possible for academics and intellectuals, I think, to say, there's something's moving, let's catch that. In this case, with the right to the city, there's actually a reciprocal sense that they need intellectuals to be involved in this project. They need to understand what it is they're trying to do with right to the city, even as they insist that taking back the land in Florida or fighting gentrification in Brooklyn or the myriad other fights that are involved. These are the centerpieces of what the right to the city movement has to be. And it seems to me that that's a project that will allow us then not just to answer the question about how new or how not new the question of urban security and new securitized regimes of urbanism are, but as Gramsci put it, of course, you can predict the future only to the extent you're involved in making it happen, that we can actually find ourselves in a position of helping to make that securitization happen in, for Lefebvre, physical terms, social terms, and psychic terms at the same time. So, thank you.
Yeah, of course. I'm sure there'll be questions. I'd like to just start with hopefully a quick question. One of the issues, this is the kind of the side thing around the question of security and militarization, of course, also relates to new forms of observing people and the whole movement towards the kind of the digital culture, the digitization of the kind of cameras in all the cities and the way that those movements are actually being watched. So I'm wondering whether you have some thoughts on the way in which the techniques of surveillance somehow have an impact in terms of the whole issue of urbanization in a way that's different than, I mean, like on the poster, we still have the police, the military police, but actually there's also a different form of kind of militarization, which is to do with this kind of invisible conditions of surveillance. So one thing is about this relation of the visible to the invisible, but I think the more sort of important question for me relates to scales of intervention. When you mention the Lefebvre right to the city, one imagines that I sort of still remember a little bit that one imagines that in that period, there's actually a greater sense of engagement with the social organization, the planning processes of the city. So there's a greater correspondence between the activists, the people who are writing those kinds of texts, and the people who are participating in the construction of some kind of alternative idea of the city. Following your own argument about the dominance of neoliberalism as a project that's sort of both dead and dominant, the sort of examples of the more, if you like, marginal attempts in terms of the revitalization of the right to the city, with small groups, seems that it has almost no authority in the light of the dominance of the neoliberalist sort of project. So given the fact that we're also working in the context of a school, and we have also planners and urban designers and architects, and hopefully in terms of the audience, we also don't want just to talk to the 12-year-olds, but to the people who are out there who are grown-ups, who are the participants in this project. I'm wondering, given the time you've spent on this question, whether you have some sort of clue for us, which is for a slightly more, not aggressive, but somehow a more dominant or stronger approach than this idea of now small groups, you know, trying to move towards the right to the city. It seems like they'll be quashed so easily. So can we participate in some kind of a bigger project, or is that just too optimistic and too naive on my part?
I don't think it's too optimistic or too naive at all. I think it's an excellent question. I think the reason that I'm, if not exactly happy to emphasize the smallness of the project just now, is that I mean, to be blunt, the left has come off easily 30 years, probably more like 40 years of defeat. And at different points along that way, in many places, Latin America, again, is a very different question, I think, and there are other exceptions. But along that way, I think there's been an almost desperate tendency for many of us to see slight movements politically and exaggerate them almost out of recognition. And I think I want to try and be careful not to do that. I think there's a contemporary sign of some of that happening, for example, with some Marxists often trained in the humanities, for example, who've now suddenly decided climate change is the only game in town, that when all of the other struggles have failed or not built the way that we hoped, suddenly a group of leftists trained in history or English literature or psychology is suddenly arguing that climate change is it, and taking word for word what 20 years ago we would have called bourgeois scientists say about climate change. Now, there's something fishy going on in the climate change discussions right now, and I don't have the expertise to talk about it, but there needs to be, without getting into climate change denying, that's just stupid, but there needs to be a much more nuanced political response. So I guess that's a kind of analogy for how I'm thinking about this. But more concretely and more to the point of that, there are actually internationally a whole number of groups springing up rapidly. I was in Budapest in May, and there are already 2 organizations there that see themselves as part of a Europe-wide Right to the City Alliance that's operating. I got an email about 3 weeks ago asking me if I'd be involved in a group organizing in Poznan, that actually there was a connection between that group and the group in Budapest. And so it's something is happening there. Whether it becomes the bigger thing that I think both of us would like, again, that depends on the work that's done. But again, you can't just take the models from the past and plant them. I don't think that's what you're suggesting either. But so we have to think through what's particular about this movement in order to make that happen. The first question about surveillance is actually very interesting, I think. And again, it's not one that I've really got into. One of the problems in the Steve Graham work, and again, I just want to stress, I think there's some extremely useful stuff in there. One of the problems there, and actually one of the problems also in some of the work on surveillance, I think, is that there's a kind of, there's a technophilia among many on the left looking at this stuff, just go, wow, look at what they're doing, you know? And I can share that, and you see the way in which images are sent on, and then you get, you're sitting at home till midnight and you're writing about it, and then you're kind of half asleep, and you sit down in front of the television, watch Law and Order, and you see the tapes from these CCTV things coming up, and it kind of reaffirms your sense of the wowness of the whole thing. So there's a bit of that going on, I think. David Pinder's done quite a lot of work on this stuff, based in Britain. London, I mean, is the capital of CCTV cameras, as everybody probably knows. And he's done some interesting, he still has a bit of that wowness going on, but he's done some very interesting stuff in it, and I tend to rely on his stuff more. I think, however, there we need some critical thinking too. Until really the middle of, well, 5 years ago, it was commonly believed that despite what we were being told, CCTV cameras really weren't doing any good. They weren't catching major criminals. The case that really broke that was the 7/7 subway bombing in London, where it does seem like they used some of the CCTV cameras in the subways. And since then, there's really not been a lot of critical analysis. New York City's just begun to put, I think, about 140 cameras into the subway system. What I've never seen, it's probably out there, but I've never seen it, is a really good analysis of the time and money and personnel hours spent to do this stuff and what they've got back from it. You know, 2 handbag robberies in a year for $5 million in the New York subway. I mean, I totally expect that these are the kinds of figures that we'll get. So I think that's the dilemma with the surveillance stuff. It's scary, but the very scariness of it feeds into the fact that we're supposed to be afraid because that makes us easier to control, you know, so somebody needs to do that.
So, Michael, or anybody who has any suggestions of the grander schema that could be out there? No, I don't mean that. I'm asking the students if they have a counter project to...
Is this a, no, it was, there was a lot of pleasure in watching you work through these 3 cases, and each time, I think very, you know, rightly and correctly coming back that the economy in the last instance sort of, you know, you brought it back to the sort of economic machine, what you call the geoeconomic sort of machinery. But I was trying to figure out why there was still something slightly unsatisfying, like it was too, kind of too correct from your position. And I was thinking of the structure of the kinds of reversals that Benjamin makes in the quotation you read, or the David Kennedy, that the law actually prepares for war rather than you know, war responding to law or law responding to war. And I was thinking about 9/11. Could it be that actually in the last instance it's not the economy only, but there's a kind of latent cultural preparation, let's say in this case a latent racism, that without that racism which we couldn't see perhaps but pre-existed, the response would have been very different. If you know, if a homegrown terrorist, if a Timothy McVeigh could have gotten it together to make that act, we wouldn't be talking about whether or not a YMCA could now be built next to the site, right? It wouldn't have gone anti-Christian, right? Or in New Orleans, obviously the classism and the racism that was latent. But my point is, rather than the economy in every case being the ground, it's almost like what might be different from earlier times is now culture itself in this sense of racism or classism or certain kind of cultural preparation, even in the cases of subprime mortgage, where they knew those mortgages were not going to be paid back, and yet, and it had to do with a certain class of customer even, right? That culture may be competing almost with the economy as being the last instance.
Yeah. No, I think that's totally correct, and I think that I would reframe it a bit, but I take the point completely. I think the Timothy McVeigh example is perfect. If a Timothy McVeigh had done this, we'd have stuck him in an insane asylum. I mean, how could a good peace-loving Christian do a thing like this? And yet here we are with the Tea Party, you know, operating. And as a recovering Presbyterian myself, and it's a long recovery. You know, you can't but see the extraordinary cultural biases that are there. The important thing, however, is when those cultural biases play out and when they don't, when they become utterly racist and discriminatory, and when they kind of get shuffled away as just a little silly or, yeah, that's there, but who cares? And that's where I think it does feed back into the security question. and actually the question of economics. I mean, who's funding the Tea Party? And a lot of the stuff that's come out in the last 2 or 3 weeks has been about multi-billionaires funding the Tea Party, that kind of right-wing support for very self-interested reasons, not just self in a personal sense, but in class terms. So the insecurity is built up through the kind of cultural lenses, if you like, as a means of, at the same time, making an economic intervention. That certain kinds of cultural assumptions and discriminatory practices and beliefs are deployed quite explicitly for that purpose. Having said that, I mean, there is a sense of which, and I don't go all the way with cultural studies at all. I don't think that there's a way in which culture has taken over as a social determinant from, say, the economy. I would prefer to say political economy. But there is a sense in which culture has become much more of a, I'm not quite sure what the language is, a social player in the last 20 or 30 years. And I think that's a very complicated question as to why that's happened. Sometimes things really are just simple. This case, I think that one's very complicated. And I think you'd have to start to look at consumption economies, which we've been doing for a while, but that's not enough. You've got to tie that back to production too. You've got to talk about identity politics coming out of the 60s and so on. But I want to be able to try and tie somehow that sense of cultural defense back to questions of security and felt insecurity, created insecurities, with some sense of economic insecurity, without necessarily prejudging which way the arrows are going, if you like.
Hi, over here. I have just an observation to make regarding your 3 moments, and also in regard to the historical process that you were talking about in terms of the economic process. And when you were speaking, you had mentioned neoliberalism and such. And previous to that, I had been actually reminded a lot of the Frankfurt School and their earlier writings on the survival of capitalism. And when I was thinking about that, it reminded me of the way that the state became involved in order to internalize and securitize the contradictions of capitalism. And what I was thinking is that today it seems as though the lead up to this point, this classical political economic turn since the 1970s, is in fact manifesting itself in a particular way today, because in order to internalize the contradictions of this classical form of political economy that we have today, particularly within cities, it has to resort to very similar processes. And I was thinking that whereas previous in the 1930s, it was the state that was internalizing everything, it's now the state acting through the global city or the network city, and all of the contradictions that are involved in that particular process, highly specific to the city. So I guess in this sense, I see this more as a scalar shift.
As a scalar shift, yeah.
Yeah, and I just like to, I'd like to see if perhaps if your thoughts perhaps that this militarization is actually another extreme form, like quasi-fascistic form of what's actually going on, back from sort of a reflection of that period. Yeah, I know.
Right, but you've got a whole page.
Oh yeah, basically.
And a lot of good ideas.
Oh, yeah.
A couple of things, really, and these are things I should have probably tried to emphasize a bit more in the talk, but one of the things, you say the Frankfurt School, it connects directly back to the last question in terms of understanding the role of culture, and Adorno, the culture industry, and so on. And there's a sign it's not just the last 20, 30 years, right? But there's something going on there, much as that language has now itself been critiqued and so on. But still, there was an insight there that Marxists had not picked up. and yeah. But two things. One, it seems to me that under the conditions of a neoliberal globalism as they were being rolled out, it wasn't the end of the nation state. That was the language in the 1980s. It was a very optimistic, utopian language of globalization theorists. It wasn't a flat earth as in Friedman. I mean, it's a flat earth maybe if you're flying at 35,000 feet on Lufthansa, as Friedman was as he contemplated the book. But if you're living down in the valleys of the Himalayas as the plane goes over on the way to Bangalore, the earth looks pretty unflat. There's been a new kind of unevenness created in the last 30 or 40 years, and it has everything to do with scale, which is that there has actually been a partial reduction in the power of nation states in the global economy. Now, it's partial and it's sectoral. There's not been a reduction in power militarily, quite the opposite. There's been a military strengthening, especially of some states over others. When the US has, by various figures, its military budget is greater than that of all other countries combined, or of the next 17 combined, depending on which figures you worry about. You can't call this a weak state. It has, however, weakened economically the ability of states to control the movement of capital. And when I say capital, I don't just mean financial capital, but people, workers moving in and out of countries. That has been compromised significantly. And what I think has happened is that the role of cities in this larger shift has changed. That no longer are cities really producing for national economies. They're no longer the, you know, if you think back, 1970s urban theory, what was it we used to say? We used to say, or I learned, I was still not quite the one saying it, but cities were the locus of reproduction. That was Lefebvre. It was Castells talking about collective consumption. It was Harvey, so on. Now, the cities are not the kind of reproduction centres for national economies, the places that provide the workers. The cities are increasingly, as metropolitan areas, metropolitan regions, they're the production centres for the global economy. You know, think Shanghai, think Dhaka, think Mumbai, and so on, Sao Paulo. So I think that's changed. I think that addresses your point very directly. But the other thing I think that's important, and the place where security comes in exactly this, is that to the extent that some of the state's functions have been taken apart, and again, it's highly uneven. This doesn't work in Italy, for example, but it works in most Western countries. To the extent that certain kinds of functions of the state, mostly focusing on support for social reproduction, mostly focusing on the redistributive activities of the Keynesian state, to the extent that they've been eroded, hollowed out, taken apart, dismantled. One of the functions that those kinds of supports performed is no longer being performed. What did we call it? We called it social security, literally. Now, the Marxist critiques, the feminist critiques, the civil rights critiques of the 60s all recognized that welfare was a form of social control. That was the argument. And of course, we've kind of lost that argument now because, you know, going back to a welfare state would seem like such a great thing, as if we could only get there, that we've forgotten, in a sense, the critiques that were coming out in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s of the function of the welfare state for social control. So when those social control mechanisms, which are kind of secondary mechanisms operating culturally indeed, but through state institutions, through social assumptions, social institutions, so on, social security, when that's eroded, the vacuum that's left in terms of literally social control, that vacuum is being filled increasingly by very direct, militarized control in the streets. And I think that really came true for me. I mean, you should always do empirical research, he said. You know, I really saw it in Toronto. You could see this vacuum literally being filled in a state that still has a larger part of the Keynesian social support systems in place than many others. But it's that vacuum that's being filled in. Now, that's pessimistic at one level, but it's optimistic on the other. There's a certain desperation. You only ever lead with military force when there's no other alternative, effectively. And for the Canadian state to have felt that in the Toronto G20 meetings, it had to rough up. I mean, it was comedic what happened in some cases. There were reporters who were arrested in this thing, and they were reporting from inside the jails. Of course, they didn't have their equipment. But one reporter of a right-wing station came out and said, I'm stunned. I had my press credentials. They just hauled me off. And I said, what about my rights? And the cop says, you don't have rights. You gave them up when you decided to protest. Several other kinds of statements like that. And this is happening to the reporters. One mayoral candidate was arrested for being in the protest. Somebody on his way to work. A cop was arrested, an undercover cop, until they figured out he was an undercover cop. And was like, it gets funnier and funnier. As you go, I mean, the incompetence of the state shouldn't be ignored either. So it seems to me that cities are being reframed in exactly the way you said, but in these very specific kinds of ways vis-a-vis security. Sorry, that went on for a while.
A quick thought, and I'm trying to think it through as well as I'm thinking, so bear with me. As captivating as the kind of triad of the three crisis stories, the Katrina, the 9/11, and the capitalist condition, I feel that it's kind of in its and acknowledging the work that has been done in kind of tracing it longer into the historical unfolding of it, I feel there is something maybe, and that might be just of a discursive nature, in the word security itself that kind of brings together different conditions in the attempt of a certain control. So I'm not sure whether that word itself, that noun that comes into the relation of different conditions, very kind of conveniently under a certain cultural, social condition, then a kind of environmental, ecological, and then a certain economic, productive force, try to legitimize or bring together a certain force or control into what might not necessarily be individually labeled security conditions. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking whether it's productive. Similarly to how you draw upon social security, I kind of encountered some kind of an energy security at some point as an attachment to a condition in which you're kind of, there's a fear from loosened control and a certain claiming back of authority, mm-hmm. whether through the military or other means. But the question is, would there possibly be other whether lenses or frameworks or a certain conceptual reworking of whether they fit together, and if so, whether security is the appropriate term to refer to them. Whether it's appropriate to build a narrative of the last 10 decades that kind of highlights these three moments as part of a same narrative. And if so, if security is, I mean, the possible alternatives or the possible individual reference other than security that could be attached to them?
I mean, I think in a lot of ways, you've helped me reframe the question, actually, that I'm trying to ask. I'm interested in security, I suppose, because I see the empirical evidence on the ground about an increased securitization of daily life. I'm interested in it because I find a lot of my students, among others, I mean, Foucault's old news now, but reading Foucault, and as well with the lectures having just come out a couple of years ago in English at least, questions of security, territory, really grabbing people's imaginations. But I'm also interested in it in a third way because, I mean, everybody wants security. There really is a psychic existential need for security. So how do we deal with that? Something's happening. Something has put security on the agenda. And of course I want to argue that it's being put on the agenda as not entirely from our volition. That there's a manipulation that's going on here. That doesn't make it any less real. And so I think I'm reframing your question, which reframed my question. But so how, if I'm getting the gist of your question, how do how do we begin to rethink that question of security vis-a-vis safety, vis-a-vis social control? And I think the urban is a good way of doing it, because the question of security could just mushroom out of control. Yeah.
I mean, social security was one of the terms that just emerged in the conversation, and that I feel is helpful in kind of bringing some light into how security kind of attaches itself to another condition. My short, research experience onto energy security kind of uses it as an umbrella term to justify access over resources and ownership over resources. So there are claims that are kind of embedded in maybe in a soothing term that security does, or a call for safety. But I feel maybe there is kind of a refusal to embrace the term as necessarily an existential condition, or in kind of thinking the construction of such an existential condition through the term that security.
Well, I think maybe I understand your question a bit better now. I mean, I think the question that needs to be asked then is, well, whose security? Yes. If you're talking about energy security or environmental security or ecological security, whose security? And with questions of food security or energy security, it seems to me the automatic kind of default switch is back to the nation state, right? More so with energy security than with, say, food security. So there's a battle on, it seems to me right now, to, not determine's too strong, there's a struggle on to write that agenda for energy security or food security, environmental security. I'm thinking about Simon Dolby's work, among others there. There's a battle on to make sure that the definitions of that language, which is going to become, already is so powerful, is that the definitions are written out in such a way. It's a struggle for ideas. They're written out in such a way that the implication is not that the nation states are the automatic crucible around which security is determined, that it's social security rather than military, class security, whatever. I don't like the idea of food security much. I really don't like the idea of energy security either. I mean, my energy security comes from food in a very direct way. Now, yeah, of course, I use electrical lights and computers and so on, but you're talking about a different world, it seems to me, than the kinds of social security that needs to be discussed.
It might not be different from the fear of words that come with a capital letter, like security with a capital letter,
right,
or nature with a capital letter, that kind of sometimes work against the threat to this, like of saying that there are voices that need to be found.
Right.
If it's going to be quick, I'm hoping that we can close, but just please go ahead, be quick. And I know that.
Well, I was surprised you said you were surprised at 140 surveillance cameras in the New York subways, and there are every bus just about in Boston has 6 or 7 surveillance cameras alone on each bus. I'm sure there are good ideas that are summarized in this phrase, the right to the city, but I have a real problem with that language, and I've mentioned it to some of the other leading sort of intellectuals that are involved in this, Peter Marcuse and others. I don't think it's a language that's going to work, that's going to take off beyond small groups that maybe have adopted it for whatever reasons. And so I think there's a problem there, and if there's an ambition to really do something larger with it, I think people who are involved, my suggestion is to think a little more, work a little harder at the language of that particular phrase. Maybe it's because it's the right to the city, and it doesn't really address whose right to the city very well in some ways, perhaps. Or another way I'm thinking about it is people looked at the Green Party in Europe and saw the success and thought, wow, we should do a Green Party here in the United States. And that doesn't work, and it doesn't translate very well in some ways, sometimes. And I'll just quickly say that earlier today I was at what will be a series of monthly meetings of a new commission to once again address the problems of the central part of Cambridge, Central Square, Cambridge, in which and this is not why I'm troubled about the right to the city, but it's an aspect of it, which is the right to the city is understood.
Just to be quick.
Well, the right to the city for many of the people who are involved, who have been invited to participate in this process, is the right to bring your kids to Central Square and not have drunks sitting on the benches. So let's, and as they've done, remove already some of the benches to solve the problems of who's right to the city.
I mean, just very quickly, I would say I think you're right to be concerned about what could happen to that language of the right to the city, and to ask the question, who's right to the city? I take my cues from, as I tried to say toward the end, the groups who are actually involved, who come back to the universities, to academics, to intellectuals, and kind of ask what can this do for them? And one group in particular, Take Back the Land in Miami, which has been extremely successful in taking foreclosed properties, taking them over, putting back the original families into the foreclosed properties, or other families, homeless folks, back into the properties, providing some of the necessary surrounding infrastructure, and actually getting away with it in the courts, where the judges have refused to take cases on behalf of the banks to re-evict people, precisely because where are they going to live? And the cops, many of whom themselves or others in their own families, presumably, are facing the same kind of crisis of housing. The cops really don't want to come and cause trouble for people who are at least living in an empty flat, an empty place. They're the ones coming to us then saying, what does this right to the city mean? Sounds good, we want to know what it means. And I think there's a certain responsibility for us to be able to kind of respond in that kind of conversation. So, yeah.
Neil, thank you very, very much. This was really a wonderful evening. I think the right to the city is really important for us in the context of a school of design, since I think it's not just to do with the language of it, it's to do with the way in which we, in a sense, think about questions like infrastructure as something that's a very physical, specific, precise manifestation of an artifact that actually produces the possibility of certain accessibility that produces rights. In that sense, I think it's great that you're here. Hopefully, it won't take as long for you to come back. Again, you should be here much more frequently. And I think this is the kind of talk that genuinely should be made mandatory for the MDes program in real estate. So I hope that we can convince our friend Rick Pizer of that fact. Thank you again, and thank you all for being here. So,
thanks. Thank you.